Sometimes the person you love most becomes the one you fear most. When trust breaks, it doesn't just shatter hearts, it changes everything. Megan Patterson is 37 weeks pregnant when her world falls apart. After a violent fight with her husband Jake, she's left alone and in labor. Clutching her head in distress, she calls 911 from their messy bedroom. Her question breaks hearts. Does every husband do this? Officer Linda Rey arrives, expecting a simple domestic call. She finds a woman torn between fear and hope, a bruise on her cheek, telling the story Jake left behind. But Jake didn't go to work like he claimed. He's been hiding nearby, consumed with guilt over what he's done. When Megan and Jake finally face each other, something unexpected happens. In her most vulnerable moment, Megan makes a choice that surprises everyone. Can love survive betrayal when a new life hangs in the balance? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wedding ring on Megan's finger had once fit perfectly. Now, at 37 weeks pregnant, it hung loose on her swollen digit, spinning around whenever she moved her hand. She twisted it absently as she sat on the edge of their unmade bed, staring at the overturned lamp on the nightstand, evidence of last night's explosion. Their apartment had never been much to look at, but it had been theirs. The small two-bedroom unit in the older part of town was all they could afford on Jake's construction wages and her part-time teaching salary. The walls were thin enough that they could hear Mrs. Chen next door watching her evening programs, and the radiator clanged all winter long. But 5 years ago, when they'd first signed the lease, Megan had seen potential in every corner. She remembered how Jake had carried her over the threshold that first day, both of them laughing because the door stuck and he had to kick it open while she was still in his arms. They'd spent their first weekend there, painting the bedroom a soft yellow, neutral enough for when they'd have children someday, Jake had said, kissing paint from her nose. That was back when Jake still talked about someday with excitement instead of dread. They'd met in college, in Professor Morrison's American literature class. Jake had been the quiet one in the back row, the guy who worked construction jobs between classes to pay his tuition. Megan had been drawn to his thoughtfulness, the way he'd listened to everyone else's opinions before offering his own, usually something insightful that made everyone reconsider their position. Their first date had been to a diner off campus, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the pie came with real whipped cream. Jake had been nervous, fumbling with his napkin while he told her about growing up in foster care, about the family he'd never really had. Megan had reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and something had settled in both of them. I want to build something real, he'd told her that night as they walked back to her dormitory. Something that lasts. They'd both wanted the same thing, a family built on love and respect, the opposite of what they'd grown up with. Megan's parents had divorced when she was 12, a bitter separation that left her shuttling between houses and feeling like she belonged nowhere. Jake's story was different but equally painful. A childhood spent in various homes, never quite fitting, never quite wanted. Together, they'd found what they'd both been searching for. The engagement ring had been modest. Jake had saved for months, working double shifts to afford even the small diamond. But when he'd gotten down on one knee in their cramped apartment, surrounded by moving boxes and the Chinese takeout they'd been eating off paper plates, Megan had cried with joy. The wedding had been simple too, held in the community center with Mrs. Chen making the decorations and their handful of close friends bringing potluck dishes. Jake's best man was Tommy, a guy from his construction crew who'd become like a brother. Megan's maid of honor was Sarah, her college roommate who'd flown in from Seattle. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect. For the first few years, everything had been perfect. Jake would come home tired but happy, covered in sawdust and paint, telling her stories about the houses he was helping to build. Megan taught 4th grade at the local elementary school, coming home with her own stories about the kids who made her laugh and occasionally broke her heart. They'd talked about having children, but decided to wait until they were more financially stable. Jake wanted to save enough for a house first, somewhere with a yard where their kids could play. Megan had dreams of converting the spare bedroom into a nursery, painting murals on the walls, and reading bedtime stories in the rocking chair her grandmother had left her. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had started to feel more like pressures. The construction industry was unpredictable. Jake would have steady work for months, then nothing for weeks at a time. They'd learned to save every penny during the good times, knowing the lean periods would come. But as the years passed, the lean periods seemed to last longer, and Jake began carrying a tension in his shoulders that never quite went away. The pregnancy hadn't been planned. They'd been trying for over a year, and when it finally happened, they were both thrilled. But the joy had been complicated by timing. Jake had just learned that his current job would end in December, right around the baby's due date. "We'll figure it out," Megan had assured him, her hand on her still flat stomach. "We always do." But Jake had started working longer hours, taking on weekend projects, anything to stockpile money before the baby arrived. He'd come home exhausted, barely, speaking through dinner before falling asleep on the couch. When Megan tried to talk about nursery plans or baby names, he'd nod absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. The first real fight had been about the crib. Megan had found one at a consignment shop, gently used but sturdy. When she'd excitedly told Jake about it, expecting him to share her enthusiasm, he'd exploded. "Do you have any idea how much we've already spent?" he'd shouted, waving bills in the air. "Doctor visits, vitamins, maternity clothes, and now you want to buy furniture we can't afford for a baby we're not ready for." The words had hit Megan like physical blows. "We're not ready for our baby," she'd whispered. Jake had immediately backed down, apologizing, explaining that he was just stressed about money. But the words hung between them, and something fundamental had shifted. Mrs. Chen had knocked on their door the next morning, bringing homemade soup and a gentle inquiry about the raised voices. The elderly Chinese woman had lived next door for 15 years, watching young couples move in and out of the building. She'd taken a special interest in Megan and Jake, occasionally bringing them vegetables from her small garden or extra portions of whatever she was cooking. "Marriage is like tending a garden," Mrs. Chen had told Megan that morning, patting her growing belly. "Must water the love every day, especially when storms come." Megan had nodded, accepting the soup and the wisdom, but she'd started to wonder if some storms were too strong for any garden to survive. As her pregnancy progressed, Jake had become increasingly distant. He'd started staying later at job sites, sometimes not coming home until after Megan was asleep. When she'd ask about his day, he'd give short answers and retreat to the couch with a beer and the television remote. The nursery remained unfinished, the walls still the same beige they'd been when they moved in. The crib sat unassembled in its box, pushed into a corner like an accusation. The stack of bills sat on their kitchen table like a judgment. Red stamps screamed "overdue" and "final notice" across envelopes that Jake had been avoiding for weeks. When he'd walked through the door that Thursday evening, his work boots heavy, on the hardwood floor, Megan had been arranging them by due date, trying to figure out which ones they could pay and which ones would have to wait. "How was work?" she'd asked, not looking up from the calculator where she'd been running the same numbers over and over, hoping they'd somehow add up differently. Jake had gone straight to the refrigerator, pulling out a beer with more force than necessary. "Fine." But it wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The job in Riverside was ending 2 weeks early. The developer had run out of money, leaving Jake's crew scrambling for their final paychecks and hunting for new work in a market that had dried up with the approaching winter. Megan had felt the baby kick against her ribs, as if sensing the tension that had become their constant companion. She'd placed her hand on her belly, trying to soothe both the child and herself. "I've been looking at these bills, and I think if we call the electric company, I said it was fine." Jake's voice had carried an edge that made Megan look up. His face was flushed, whether from the cold outside or frustration, she couldn't tell. His hair was disheveled, and there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before, a wildness that made her stomach clench. "Jake, we need to talk about this. The baby's coming in 3 weeks, and you think I don't know that?" He'd slammed the beer bottle down on the counter hard enough to make her flinch. "You think I don't lie awake every night thinking about how I'm failing at everything?" Megan had stood slowly, her hand still protective over her belly. At 8 months pregnant, sudden movements made her dizzy, but something about Jake's tone had triggered an instinct to be ready to move if necessary. "You're not failing," she'd said softly. "We're going through a rough patch, but a rough patch?" Jake had laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Megan, we can't even pay our electric bill. I'm about to lose my job. We're having a baby in 3 weeks, and you want to talk about nursery decorations and baby names like we're living in some fairy tale. I just thought maybe we could discuss what? How I'm supposed to provide for a family when I can barely keep the lights on. How I'm supposed to be a father when I don't even know what the hell I'm doing with my own life." The baby had kicked again, harder this time, and Megan had winced. "Please just calm down. This isn't good for—" "Don't tell me to calm down," Jake had roared, and suddenly he was standing too, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm sick of pretending. Everything's okay when it's not. I'm sick of you acting like we can just positive think our way out of this mess." Megan had backed toward the bedroom, her heart pounding. She'd never seen Jake like this. His face contorted with rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This wasn't the man she'd married, the gentle soul who used to rub her feet when they were swollen and bring her ice cream when she was having cravings. "I'm not pretending," she'd said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm trying to figure out solutions." Solutions? Jake had followed her into the bedroom, his voice rising with each word. "What solutions? Your part-time teaching job that pays practically nothing. My construction work that just disappeared. Face it, Megan, we're screwed, and bringing a baby into this disaster is the most selfish thing we could do." The words had hit her like a physical blow. Selfish? Yes, selfish. What kind of life are we going to give this kid? A father who can't keep a job and a mother who thinks everything will work out if she just tries hard enough. Tears had started streaming down Megan's face. "This is our baby, Jake, our child. How can you call that selfish? Because we can't afford it. Because I can't afford it. Do you understand that? I can't take care of you, and I sure as hell can't take care of a baby." He'd grabbed the ultrasound picture from the mirror, the one where you could clearly see their daughter's profile, her tiny nose and perfect lips. For a moment, Megan had thought he was going to tear it up, and she'd reached for it instinctively. "Don't," she'd whispered. That's when it happened. Jake had pushed her hand away, but his movement was too forceful, too angry. His palm connected with her cheek with a crack that seemed to echo through the small room. The sound hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Megan had staggered backward, her hand flying to her face. The baby had gone still inside her, as if it too was shocked by what had just occurred. For a moment neither of them had moved, both frozen by the magnitude of what Jake had just done. "Megan," Jake's voice had cracked, the anger draining from his face and being replaced by horror. "Oh God, I didn't mean—" But Megan had been backing away from him, shaking her head. The man standing in front of her was a stranger, and she was suddenly, viscerally afraid of him. "Get out," she'd whispered. "Megan, please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Get out!" The words had torn from her throat with a force that surprised them both. Jake had stood there for another moment, his hands reaching toward her as if he could somehow undo what he'd just done. But when he'd seen the fear in her eyes, real, primal fear of him, something had broken in his expression. "I'm sorry," he'd said again, but the words sounded hollow, insufficient. He'd grabbed his jacket from the chair and headed for the door, pausing only to look back at her one more time. "I'm so sorry, Megan." The door had closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. Megan had sunk onto the bed, her whole body trembling. The room felt Different now, contaminated by violence and broken trust. She touched her cheek where his hand had connected, already feeling it beginning to swell. The baby had started moving again, restless and agitated, as if picking up on her distress. She'd rubbed her belly in slow circles, whispering apologies to her unborn daughter for the chaos she was being born into. That had been 12 hours ago. 12 hours of lying awake, replaying the moment over and over, trying to understand how they'd gone from discussing bills to Jake hitting her. 12 hours of waiting for him to come home, to explain, to make it make sense somehow. But he hadn't come home. And now the contractions were starting. Officer Linda Rey had been responding to domestic calls for 12 years, and she'd learned to read the signs before she even knocked on a door. The neighbor who'd called it in, an elderly Chinese woman with worried eyes, had described hearing shouting, then silence, then a woman crying through the thin walls. Now, standing outside apartment 2B, Rey could feel the particular kind of stillness that followed violence. She knocked gently, her badge catching the morning light filtering through the hallway window. "Police. Ma'am, we got a call about a welfare check." The voice that answered was small, strained. "I'm okay. Everything's fine." Rey had heard those words 1,000 times. They almost always meant the opposite. "Ma'am, I'd still like to speak with you if that's all right. Make sure you're safe." She heard movement inside, slow, careful footsteps. When the door opened, Rey saw exactly what she'd expected to see: a young woman, heavily pregnant, with a bruise blooming across her left cheek and eyes that held too much fear for someone who was supposedly fine. "I'm Officer Rey," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "May I come in?" Megan hesitated, her hand still on the doorknob. Rey could see her weighing her options: lie and send the officer away, or let her in and face whatever consequences might follow. "It's just me," Rey added. "I'm here to help." Something in her tone must have reached through Megan's fear, because she stepped back and opened the door wider. Rey took in the small apartment with a practiced eye: overturned lamp, scattered papers. On the floor, a wedding photo face down on the nightstand. Classic signs of a domestic disturbance. But it was the woman herself who drew Rey's attention. Even frightened and bruised, there was something strong about her posture, the way she held herself, despite obviously being in pain. Rey had seen too many victims who seemed broken by their circumstances. This one looked like she was still fighting. "I'm Megan," the woman said, unconsciously touching her cheek. "Megan Patterson. It's nice to meet you, Megan. Can you tell me, what happened to your face?" Megan's eyes darted away. "I fell. I'm clumsy because of the pregnancy." "Megan," Rey's voice was kind but firm. "I've been doing this for a long time. That's not a fall bruise. Someone hit you." The words hung in the air between them. Rey watched as Megan's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Her shoulders sagged, and she pressed both hands to her belly, as if protecting the life inside. From the truth they were discussing, Rey had been where Megan was now. Not the physical abuse, she'd been lucky there, but the aftermath of loving someone who hurt you. Her ex-husband Marcus had been an emotional terrorist, systematically destroying her self-worth with words instead of fists. She'd stayed for 3 years, making excuses, believing his promises to change, until one day she'd realized she was disappearing bit by bit. That experience had shaped how she approached calls like this one. She knew that pushing too hard, too fast, would only make victims retreat further into denial and self-protection. "Where's your husband now?" Rey asked, settling into a chair across from where Megan had lowered herself carefully onto the couch. "He went to work." The lie came automatically, but Rey could see the uncertainty behind it. "What kind of work does he do?" "Construction. He's working on a development in Riverside." Rey made a note, though she suspected Jake Patterson wasn't at any job site this morning. "When did he leave for work?" Megan's hand went to her belly as another contraction began. Rey watched her breathe through it, noting the timing. This wasn't just a domestic situation, it was potentially a medical emergency. Last night, Megan whispered when the contraction passed, after we had a fight. About what? Money, bills, the baby coming. Tears started flowing again. He's been so stressed, and I just kept pushing about getting ready for the baby, and he snapped. Has he hit you before? No. The answer came quickly, emphatically. Never. Jake's not like that. He's gentle, he's kind. This isn't him. Ray nodded, keeping her expression neutral. She'd heard variations of this story countless times. But he did hit you last night. Megan's fingers traced the bruise on her cheek. He was so angry, angrier than I'd ever seen him. And when I reached for the ultrasound picture, he was holding it, and I thought he might tear it up. He just pushed my hand away too hard. Where's the ultrasound picture now? Megan pointed to the dresser, where the small black and white photo sat propped against a jewelry box. Ray could see the baby's profile clearly, the tiny features that made the whole situation even more tragic. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Megan doubled over slightly. Ray glanced at her watch, timing it. 7 minutes since the last one. Megan, how long have you been having contractions? Since about 5 this morning. They're not that bad yet. But even as she said it, another wave of pain crossed her face. Have you called your doctor? No. I keep thinking Jake will come home first. He should be here for this. We planned it. He was going to drive me to the hospital, time the contractions, help me through it. Her voice broke. I can't do this without him. Ray felt a familiar ache in her chest. She'd seen this so many times. Women who'd been hurt by the very people they loved most, still hoping those same people would show up to save them. Let me call for a paramedic to check you out, Ray said, reaching for her radio. No! Megan's voice was sharp with panic. If you call an ambulance, everyone will know something's wrong. The neighbors, his work. Megan, you're in labor. Your safety and the baby's safety have to come first. But what if Jake comes back and I'm not here? What if he thinks I left him? Ray studied the young woman's face, seeing the complex tangle of love, fear, and hope that kept so many women trapped in impossible situations. Do you want him to come back? The question seemed to surprise Megan. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands moving in slow circles over her belly. I don't know, she finally whispered. I love him. I love the man I married, but last night I was scared of him. Really scared. I've never felt that way about Jake before. That must be terrifying. It is. Because if I can't trust him, who can I trust? He's my family. He's all I have. Ray leaned forward slightly. Megan, you have choices. You have options. But right now, we need to make sure you and your baby are safe. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, their presence making the small apartment feel even smaller. Megan watched from the bed as they unpacked their equipment, her anxiety spiking with each new piece of medical gear they produced. Mom, I'm Dave, and this is my partner Sarah, the older paramedic said, his voice professionally calm. We're going to check you and the baby, make sure everything's progressing normally. While they worked, checking blood pressure, listening to the baby's heartbeat, timing contractions, Officer Rey stepped outside to coordinate with her partner, Officer Martinez, who had arrived to help canvass the neighborhood for Jake. Mrs. Chen was waiting in the hallway, wringing her hands and speaking in a mixture of English and Chinese. Is she okay? The baby okay? I heard crying all night, then shouting, then quiet. Too quiet. She's getting medical attention now, Ray assured her. Can you tell me what you heard exactly? Fighting, loud voices, then sound like something breaking, then man's voice, very angry, very loud, then door slam. No more sounds after that until crying this morning. Did you see the man leave? Mrs. Chen shook her head. I hear trucks start up, drive away fast. Maybe 11 o'clock last night. Ray made notes, building a timeline of the previous evening's events. Martinez returned from checking the parking area and nearby streets. No sign of him, Martinez reported. Neighbors say they haven't seen Jake Patterson since yesterday evening. His truck's not in his usual spot. Back inside the apartment, the paramedics were finishing their assessment. You're in early labor, Sarah told Megan. Contractions are about 6 minutes apart, but they're still relatively mild. The baby's heartbeat is strong. So I don't have to go to the hospital yet? Megan asked hopefully. Well, that depends on several factors, Dave said carefully, glancing at Officer Rey. Your stress levels are quite elevated, which isn't ideal for labor. And given your current situation— What situation? Megan's voice turned defensive. I'm fine. The baby's fine. You just said so. Rey sat down beside the bed. Megan, we need to talk about safety planning for you and the baby. Safety from what? Jake would never hurt the baby. He would never hurt me intentionally. What happened last night, it wasn't really him. Sarah, the female paramedic, knelt beside the bed. Rey noticed she wasn't wearing a wedding ring, but there was a faded mark where one had been. Another woman who understood complicated relationships. I hear what you're saying, Sarah said gently. But the fact is, you're about to give birth, and you need to be in a safe, calm environment. Stress can complicate labor in ways that put both you and the baby at risk. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming bowl. I bring soup, she announced, ignoring the crowd of officials in the small apartment. She set the bowl on the nightstand and placed a gentle hand on Megan's forehead. You eat needs strength for baby. The simple kindness of the gesture broke something loose in Megan. Tears started flowing again, and she reached for Mrs. Chen's weathered hand. He hit me, she whispered, as if saying it to the grandmother-like figure made it more real, more manageable somehow. Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change, but her grip on Megan's hand tightened. I know, dear one. I hear. I see many things in 50 years living here. No difference between normal fight and dangerous fight. What do you mean? Rey asked. Mrs. Chen looked around the room, at the overturned lamp, the scattered bills, the wedding photo face down on the dresser. This is not first time things thrown in this apartment, but last night different. Last night I think maybe I call police, then quiet come, and I think maybe finished. But quiet too long, too scared feeling. Megan looked stricken. You've heard us fighting before. Walls very thin. Past few months hear voices raised many times. But always stop before too bad. Last night, not stop. Rey processed this new information. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to make a statement about what you've observed? The elderly woman nodded firmly. I help however I can. This girl need help. Baby needs safe place to be born. Another contraction hit Megan, stronger than the previous ones. She gripped the bedsheets and tried to breathe through it, the way they'd learned in childbirth class. Classes Jake had attended faithfully until the last few weeks, when work stress had made him too distracted to participate. That was only 4 minutes since the last one, Sarah observed, checking her watch. They're getting closer together. I want to wait for Jake, Megan said through gritted teeth as the contraction subsided. He should be here. We're supposed to do this together. Rey's radio crackled. Martinez's voice came through. Rey, I've got eyes on a pickup truck matching the description, parked about 4 blocks away on Elm Street. Male subject sitting inside appears distressed. Megan's head snapped up. That's him. That's Jake. He didn't go to work. He's been sitting in his truck this whole time. Ma'am, please stay calm, Dave said, noting how her blood pressure monitor had started beeping. We need to keep your stress levels down. But Megan was already trying to sit up. If he's just sitting there, that means he's thinking. He's trying to figure out what to do. Jake always sits in his truck when he needs to think. Rey stood up. I'm going to go talk to him. No! Megan's voice was sharp with panic. Please, if you approach him like he's a criminal, he'll run. Jake doesn't handle confrontation well with authority figures. He grew up in foster care, and cops always meant trouble. Then what do you suggest? Megan was quiet for a moment, thinking through another contraction. When it passed, she looked directly at Rey. Let me call him. If he's just sitting there, his phone is probably on. Let me tell him I'm in labor, that I need him. If he loves me, if he loves this baby, he'll come. Rey considered this. It went against protocol, but she'd learned that domestic situations rarely followed the rule book. And if he doesn't answer, or if he does answer but refuses to come, then you'll know what kind of man he really is, Megan said quietly. And so will I. Sarah checked her watch again. If we're doing this, it needs to be soon. Labor is progressing, and we need to make some decisions about where you want to deliver this baby. Mrs. Chen patted Megan's hand. You call him. But I stay here with you no matter what. You not alone. Ray pulled out her own phone. What's his number? Jake Patterson sat in his truck 4 blocks from home, staring at his work boots on the passenger seat. They were caked with dried mud from yesterday's job site, the job site he was supposed to be at right now, pretending everything was normal. Instead, he'd been sitting here for 3 hours, watching the morning commute pass by his windows while his entire world crumbled around him. The steering wheel bore the impressions of his white knuckles. Every few minutes he'd start the engine, intending to drive to work and act like nothing had happened. Then he'd remember the sound his hand had made connecting with Megan's cheek, and he'd turn the engine off again. He'd hit his pregnant wife, the woman he loved more than his own life, the mother of his unborn child. The realization kept hitting him in waves, each one more nauseating than the last. This wasn't who he was supposed to be. This wasn't the man Megan had married, the man who'd promised to love and protect her. This was someone else entirely, someone who looked like Jake Patterson but acted like... Jake squeezed his eyes shut, but the comparison he was trying to avoid forced its way into his consciousness anyway. He was acting like Ray Donovan. Ray had been Jake's foster father from ages 8 to 11, the worst 3 years of a childhood that had been difficult from the beginning. Ray was a big man with big hands and a bigger temper, especially after he'd been drinking, which was most nights. You're worthless, Ray used to say, usually right before those big hands would connect with whatever part of Jake he could reach. Nobody wants you. Nobody will ever want you. You're damaged goods. Jake had sworn he'd never become Ray Donovan. He'd spent his teenage years in therapy, working through anger and abandonment issues. He'd thought he'd overcome all of that. He'd thought love, real love, the kind he'd found with Megan, was enough to keep the darkness at bay. Apparently, he'd been wrong. His phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him from his spiral of self-loathing. For a moment, he hoped it might be his supervisor at the construction site, calling to ask where he was. A normal problem he could handle with a lie and an excuse. But the caller ID showed home, and Jake's stomach dropped. Megan was calling him. He stared at the phone, paralyzed. What could he possibly say to her? How could he explain what he'd done when he didn't understand it himself? How could he apologize for crossing a line that once crossed could never be? Uncrossed, the phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Megan was persistent when she needed to talk to him. One of the things he'd always loved about her. She didn't play games or give him the silent treatment when they had problems. She confronted things head-on, believing that anything could be worked out if they just talked it through honestly. But this wasn't something they could talk through. This was a fundamental break in who Jake thought he was as a person. The phone rang a 3rd time. With shaking hands, Jake answered. Jake? Megan's voice was strained, breathless. He could hear other voices in the background. Strangers. Megan, I'm in labor. The words cut through whatever apology he'd been trying to form. It started this morning and the contractions are getting closer. I need you to come home. Jake's vision went white around the edges. Labor? But you're not due for... The stress triggered it. Her voice broke slightly on the words. Jake, I'm scared. I know what happened last night was terrible, but I can't do this alone. Please, come home. Through the phone, he could hear a woman's voice saying something about timing contractions. There were people in their apartment, medical people from... The sound of it. Maybe police. Who's there with you, he asked. Paramedics. And Officer Ray, Mrs. Chen, called for a welfare check after she heard us fighting. Police. Jake's hands started shaking harder. He'd grown up knowing that police meant trouble, meant being taken away, meant losing whatever stability he'd managed to build. Even though he was an adult now, that childhood fear lived in his bones. "Are they going to arrest me?" he whispered. "I don't know. That depends on what you do next." Megan's voice was getting stronger, more focused. "Jake, I'm about to have our baby, our daughter. She needs both of her parents, but she needs them to be safe. I need to know that you're going to get help." "Help?" "For your anger, for whatever made you think it was okay to hit me." There was steel in her voice now, despite the pain he could hear underneath. "Jake, I love you, but I can't love someone who hurts me. And I won't bring our daughter into a home where violence is possible." Jake pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. She was right, of course. She was always right about the important things. But the thought of asking for help, of admitting to strangers that he'd become everything he'd sworn he'd never be, made his throat close up with shame. "I don't know how," he said finally. "You start by coming home. You face what you did. You talk to the police officer. You talk to me, and you commit to getting the help you need." Another voice came through the phone. The paramedic, Jake realized. "Ma'am, we need to make some decisions about transport soon." "Jake, did you hear that? They want to take me to the hospital, but I want you here first. I want us to face this together, the right way." Jake looked at his reflection in the rear view mirror. He looked like his father, not the biological father he'd never known, but Ray Donovan. Same hollow eyes, same expression of a man who'd let his worst impulses win. The resemblance was so strong it made him physically sick, but maybe it wasn't. Too late to choose differently. "I'm coming," he said, his voice barely audible. "What? I'm coming home. I'm going to face this." "Jake," Megan's voice caught. "Are you sure? Because if you come home and then run, if you make promises, you can't." "I don't think I'll survive it." Jake started the engine. For the first time in hours, his hands felt steady. "I'm not running, Megan. I'm done running from things. I'm coming home to you and our daughter, and I'm going to figure out how to be the man you both deserve." "The how?" "Police are here." "I know, that's okay. I need to take responsibility for what I did." Through the phone he could hear Megan talking to someone else, telling them he was coming, asking them to wait. Then she was back. "I love you," she said, and it sounded like both a promise and a goodbye. "I love you too. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that." Jake hung up and put the truck in drive. The 4 blocks to their apartment felt like the longest distance he'd ever traveled. At every stop sign, he had to fight the urge to turn around and keep driving, to disappear into whatever life awaited men who'd lost everything through their own choices. But Megan was in labor with their daughter, and she needed him to be brave enough to come home and face what he'd done. She needed him to be better than Ray Donovan had ever been. For the first time in his life, Jake was going to choose courage over fear. When he pulled into their apartment complex, he could see the ambulance in the parking lot, its lights flashing. But no siren, not an emergency yet, but ready to become one. A police cruiser was parked beside it. Jake turned off the engine and sat for a moment, looking up at their bedroom window. He could see shadows moving behind the curtains, people taking care of Megan while he sat in a parking lot wrestling with his demons. His work boots were still on the passenger seat, covered in yesterday's mud. Tomorrow, he'd probably be looking for a new job. Tomorrow, he might be in jail. Tomorrow, everything about his life might be different. But today, his daughter was being born. Today, he had a chance to choose who he wanted to be as a father. Jake got out of the truck and walked toward the building, his legs feeling like lead. Each step was a choice, to face the consequences, to seek help, to try to become worthy of the family he'd nearly destroyed. Officer Martinez was waiting by the building's front door, his hand resting casually on his radio. He looked young, probably, new to this kind of call. "Mr. Patterson?" Martinez's voice was professionally neutral. "Yes. I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them and move slowly. We're here to help, but everyone's safety is the priority." Jake nodded, raising his hand slightly. "I understand. I just want to see my wife. She's having our baby. I know. Officer Rey is upstairs with her. She's the one who's going to help us figure out the next steps." As they walked into the building together, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The strange relief that came with finally getting caught, with having adults take charge when you'd proven you couldn't handle things yourself. He was scared of what came next. But for the first time in months, he wasn't carrying the weight of his secrets alone. Officer Rey heard the footsteps on the stairs before Martinez's radio crackled to announce Jake's arrival. Megan's entire body tensed at the sound, her hand instinctively going to her bruised cheek. The contractions were coming every 3 minutes now, and Sarah had already started preparing for the possibility that they might have to deliver the baby right here in the apartment. "He's coming up," Rey told her gently. "Are you ready for this?" Megan nodded, though her face was pale with more than just labor pains. "I think so. I have to be." Mrs. Chen moved closer to the bed, positioning herself as a protective presence. The elderly woman had refused to leave despite the crowd of officials, claiming she'd promised to stay with Megan no matter what. Rey had decided to allow it. Sometimes, the most healing presence in a crisis was someone who offered unconditional support. The bedroom door opened, and Martinez entered first, followed by Jake. Rey studied the man who had caused all this upheaval. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 20s, with the build of someone who worked with his hands. His face was haggard, eyes red-rimmed from what looked like a sleepless night. When he saw Megan on the bed, surrounded by medical equipment and official personnel, something crumbled in his expression. "Oh God," he whispered. "Megan, are you okay? Is the baby—" "Mr. Patterson," Rey interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "I need you to stay right there while we talk." Jake stopped, mid-step, his hands raised slightly as Martinez had instructed downstairs. His eyes never left Megan's face, drinking in every detail, the bruise he'd left, the medical monitoring equipment, the way she was breathing through another contraction. "The baby's heartbeat is strong," Megan managed to say when the contraction passed. "But the stress triggered early labor. Because of what you did to me." The words hit Jake like physical blows. Rey watched as he absorbed the full weight of the consequences. Not just that he'd hurt his wife, but that his violence had potentially endangered their unborn child. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice broke completely. "Megan, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened to me last night. I don't know who that was." "It was you, Jake." Megan's voice was steady despite her obvious pain. "It was you who decided our financial problems were my fault. It was you who called me selfish for being excited about our baby. It was you who hit me when I tried to protect our daughter's ultrasound picture." Rey noted how Megan was taking control of the narrative, refusing to let Jake minimize what had happened. It was a good sign. Many domestic violence victims initially blamed themselves or made excuses for their abusers. "You're right," Jake said. "It was me, and I hate myself for it." "Hating yourself isn't enough," Megan said, gripping the bedsheets. As another contraction began, "Self-hatred doesn't protect me. It doesn't protect our daughter." Dave, the paramedic, cleared his throat. "Folks, I need to interrupt. These contractions are now 2 minutes apart. We need to make a decision about transport, or we're going to be delivering this baby right here." Rey looked at Megan. "What do you want to do?" "I want to talk to my husband first." Alone. Megan's voice carried a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including Jake. 5 minutes. Then we'll go to the hospital." Rey hesitated. Protocols suggested keeping the parties separated until they could fully assess the situation. But something in Megan's demeanor suggested she wasn't a woman who could be pushed around, not anymore. "I'll be right outside the door," Rey said finally. "Mrs. Chen, you too, 5 minutes." The room cleared except for Megan and Jake, though Rey positioned herself where she could respond immediately if needed. Through the thin walls, she could hear their voices, Megan's firm and clear, Jake's broken and pleading. Mrs. Chen stood beside Rey in the hallway, listening intently. "She, strong girl," the elderly woman murmured, "stronger than she know." "Have you seen signs of abuse before?" Rey asked quietly. Mrs. Chen considered this. Not hitting, no, but past few months, hear him raise voice more. Hear her crying at night sometimes, see her getting smaller, more worried, like she walking on, how you say, eggshells. Rey nodded grimly. The pattern was familiar. Gradual escalation, emotional abuse building toward physical violence. The pregnancy had probably intensified existing stresses and pushed Jake over the edge he'd been approaching for months. Inside the bedroom, they could hear Megan's voice rising. You want to make this right? Then you get help, real help, not just promises and apologies. Jake's response was too quiet to hear, but Megan's next words were crystal clear. I love you, Jake, but I love this baby more, and I love myself enough not to accept this. Martinez raised his eyebrows at Rey. It wasn't what either of them had expected to hear from a domestic violence victim. Usually, there were more excuses, more hope that things would just go back to normal. Sarah, the paramedic, checked her watch. 4 minutes. If we don't move soon... Megan's voice called out from the bedroom. We're ready. Rey opened the door to find Jake sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Megan's hand while she breathed through a contraction. His face was streaked with tears, but his expression had changed. The desperation had been replaced by something that looked like resolve. We're going to the hospital, Megan announced. Jake's going to ride in the ambulance with me, but Officer Rey, I need you to follow us. After the baby's born, Jake and I need to discuss what happens next, and he needs to talk to you about taking responsibility for what he did. Rey studied Jake's face. Mr. Patterson, are you agreeing to cooperate with our investigation? Jake nodded without hesitation. Yes, I want to do whatever I need to do to make this right, starting with admitting what I did and getting help so it never happens again. And you understand that could mean arrest, charges, legal consequences. I understand. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. I can't undo what I did, but I can face the consequences. Megan and our daughter deserve better than a man who runs away from his mistakes. Another contraction hit Megan, stronger than the previous ones. This time, she gripped Jake's hand and let him help her breathe through it. When it passed, she looked directly at Rey. I know this isn't normal, she said. I know most women in my situation wouldn't want their abuser at the hospital. But Jake isn't just my abuser. He's my husband and the father of my child. If he's serious about getting help, if he's serious about changing, then I want our daughter born into healing, not just more trauma. Rey had seen a lot of domestic situations, but she'd never seen one quite like this. Megan, are you sure you feel safe with him present? Megan looked at Jake, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time in months. No, she said finally. I'm not sure I feel safe, but I'm sure I feel hopeful, and maybe that's enough to start with. The ambulance ride to Mercy General Hospital took 12 minutes, but it felt like hours to Jake. He sat beside Megan's stretcher, holding her hand through contractions, while trying to process everything that had happened in the past hour. Officer Rey followed behind in her patrol car, and Jake knew that his reckoning was far from over. At the hospital, everything became a whirlwind of activity. Megan was whisked into labor and delivery, while Jake was directed to wait in a small family consultation room. Officer Rey appeared a few minutes later, closing the door behind her. Mr. Patterson, we need to finish our conversation, she said, settling into a chair across from him. I need you to walk me through exactly what happened last night. Jake took a shaky breath and began to tell the whole story. The bills, the stress about losing his job, the fight about money, the moment when his anger had overwhelmed his better judgment. Rey listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. Have you ever been violent toward Megan before? She asked. No, never. Jake's voice was firm on this point. Last night was the first time I ever laid a hand on her, but... He paused, struggling with how to explain the complexity of what had been building inside him. But what? I've been angry, more and more angry over the past few months, at work, at home, at everything. I kept telling myself it was just stress, that it would pass when the baby came and I found steady work again. But it was getting harder to control. Ray nodded, recognizing the pattern. "Mr. Patterson, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. After you left the apartment last night, where did you go?" "I drove around for a while. Then I parked on Elm Street and just sat there. All night." Jake hesitated. This was where it got complicated, where he had to admit to thoughts that made him ashamed to even remember them. "Not all night. Around 3. In the morning, I drove out to Miller's Bridge." Ray's pen stopped moving. Miller's Bridge was notorious in their small city, a high concrete span over the river where desperate people sometimes went to end their pain permanently. "What did you do at Miller's Bridge, Jake?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake stared at his hands, remembering the feeling of standing at the bridge's railing, looking down at the dark water below, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd done to the person he loved most. "I wrote a letter," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "What kind of letter?" Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, a gas station receipt with cramped handwriting covering both sides. His hands shook as he handed it to Officer Rey. She read silently, her expression growing more serious with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Jake with something that might have been understanding mixed with concern. "Mr. Patterson, this reads like a suicide note." "Because that's what it was," Jake's voice cracked. "I stood on that bridge for 2 hours thinking about how I'd become exactly what I swore I'd never be. My foster father used to hit me and my foster mother. I watched him destroy our family with his anger and violence. I promised myself I'd never be like him. But last night when I saw the fear in Megan's eyes, fear of me, I realized I had become him." Ray set the letter down carefully. "But you didn't go through with it." "No. I kept thinking about Megan having the baby alone, raising our daughter with the knowledge that her father was so ashamed of hurting her mother that he took the coward's way out. I kept thinking about how she'd blame herself, wonder if there was something she could have done differently." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "And I realized that killing myself wouldn't undo what I'd done. It would just create more trauma. So what did you do?" "I drove back toward home. I was going to come upstairs and face what I'd done, but then I lost my nerve. I sat in the truck for hours, trying to work up the courage to knock on our door." Ray studied Jake's face, reassessing everything she thought she knew about this situation. The suicide note changed the dynamic completely. This wasn't a typical case of domestic violence escalating. This was a man who'd been so horrified by his own actions that he'd contemplated ending his life rather than face the possibility of hurting his family again. "Jake, have you ever talked to anyone about your childhood experiences? About what you witnessed in foster care?" "Some. Megan knows the basics, but I never connected it to what's been happening to me lately. The anger, the feeling like I was losing control." He looked directly at Ray for the first time since they'd started talking. "Do you think that's what this is? Some kind of cycle repeating itself?" "I think it's possible. Trauma has a way of surfacing when we're under stress, especially around major life changes, like becoming a parent." Ray leaned forward slightly. "Jake, I need to ask you something important. If you felt suicidal last night, do you feel that way now?" Jake considered the question seriously. "No. When I heard Megan was in labor, when I realized I might miss the birth of my daughter because I was sitting in a parking lot, feeling sorry for myself, something shifted. I don't want to die. I want to live, but I want to live as a better man than I was last night." "What does that look like to you?" "It looks like getting help, real help, not just promising to do better. It looks like understanding why I have this anger inside me and learning how to handle it before it hurts anyone else. It looks like proving to Megan and our daughter that I can be the husband and father they deserve." Ray made more notes, her mind working through the legal and practical implications of what Jake was telling her. The suicide note complicated things significantly. A man contemplating ending his life wasn't exactly the same as a man who hit his wife and went about his business. The level of remorse, the immediate self-awareness of the wrongness of his actions, it spoke to someone in crisis rather than someone with an established pattern of abuse. Jake, I'm going to be honest with you. Based on what you've told me and what I've observed, I think you need immediate psychiatric evaluation. The fact that you were contemplating suicide last night, combined with the domestic incident, suggests you're in a mental health crisis. What does that mean? Am I going to jail? It means we're going to focus on getting you the help you need, while ensuring your family's safety. The charges will still have to be addressed, but right now, I'm more concerned about making sure you don't hurt yourself or anyone else. Jake nodded, feeling something like relief for the first time in hours. Whatever you think is best, I just want to do right by them. The hospital bracelet felt foreign on Megan's wrist as she was wheeled into labor and delivery room 3. The plastic band read Patterson Megan in bold black letters, along with her date of birth and medical record number, reducing her to essential information at the moment when she felt most vulnerable and complex. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the attending obstetrician, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands. She examined Megan quickly and efficiently while explaining what was happening. "You're at 6 centimeters, she said, peeling off her gloves. "The baby's in good position, and her heart rate is strong despite the stressful circumstances. But I need to be honest with you. The emotional trauma you've experienced could affect your labor in various ways. Some women find that stress makes labor longer and more difficult. Others experience very rapid progression." "What about Jake?" Megan asked, her voice tight with another approaching contraction. "Is he allowed to be here?" Dr. Martinez glanced toward the door, where she could see Officer Rey talking quietly with a hospital social worker. "That's being discussed there. Our protocols when domestic violence is involved, safety considerations for both you and the staff." The contraction hit before Megan could respond, and she gripped the bed rails as the wave of pain washed over her. When it passed, she found Dr. Martinez studying her with concern. "Megan, I have to ask, do you feel safe with your husband present during delivery?" It was the same question Officer Rey had asked, but somehow it felt different coming from the doctor who would be guiding her through birth. Megan had been thinking about it constantly since they'd arrived at the hospital. "I don't know," she said honestly. 2 days ago, I would have said absolutely yes. Jake has been to every doctor's appointment, every childbirth class. We planned this together. He was going to cut the cord, help with the first feeding. But now, she touched the bruise on her cheek, still tender and swollen. "Now I don't know who he is anymore." The door opened, and Jake appeared with Officer Rey behind him. He looked different somehow, smaller, more vulnerable. His eyes immediately went to Megan's face, and she saw them linger on the bruise he'd left there. "The psychiatric team is on their way up," Officer Rey told Dr. Martinez quietly, "and we've arranged for a social worker to be present for any interactions between Mr. and Mrs. Patterson." Jake approached the bed cautiously, as if Megan might tell him to leave at any moment. "How are you feeling? How's the baby?" "Scared," Megan admitted, "and in pain. The contractions are getting stronger." "I'm scared too," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared I've ruined everything. Scared our daughter is going to be born into this mess I created." Dr. Martinez stepped between them. "Mr. Patterson, I understand you want to support your wife, but my primary concern is her medical well-being and the safety of this delivery. If your presence causes her additional stress, it's okay," Megan interrupted, surprising everyone, including herself. "I want him here. If he's really serious about getting help, if he's really committed to changing, then I want our daughter, born into that commitment, not just born into fear and separation." Another contraction began, stronger than the previous ones. Without thinking, Jake reached for Megan's hand, and she let him take it. She squeezed hard, using his grip to anchor herself through the pain. "Breathe with me," he said softly. falling back into the rhythm they'd practiced in childbirth class. In through your nose, out through your mouth. When the contraction passed, Megan looked at him with tears in her eyes. I missed you, she whispered, even after what you did. Even though I'm afraid of you now, I missed you. Jake's face crumpled. I missed you too. I've been missing you for months, even when we were in the same room. I've been disappearing into my own anger and fear, and I didn't even realize it was happening. The psychiatric team arrived then. Dr. James Chen, no relation to their neighbor despite the name, and a crisis counselor named Lisa Rodriguez. Dr. Chen was a soft-spoken man who introduced himself to both Megan and Jake, explaining that he'd been called in to assess the situation and provide support. I understand there was a domestic incident last night, and that Mr. Patterson was experiencing suicidal ideation, Dr. Chen said, consulting his notes. I also understand that Mrs. Patterson is in active labor. This is a complex situation that requires careful handling. Lisa, the crisis counselor, pulled up a chair beside the bed. Megan, I want you to know that you have support here beyond just your husband. Whatever happens between you two, you're not alone in this. What happens if Jake needs to be hospitalized for psychiatric reasons? Megan asked. What happens to us? We take things one step at a time, Dr. Chen replied. Right now, the priority is ensuring everyone's immediate safety and supporting you through labor. After the baby is born, we can assess Mr. Patterson more thoroughly and discuss treatment options. Jake looked at the assembled team of professionals, the obstetrician, the police officer, the psychiatrist, the counselor. 6 months ago, the idea of having so many people involved in their private life would have terrified him. Now he felt something like gratitude. I want to cooperate with whatever you think is best, he told Dr. Chen. I want to get better. I want to be the father my daughter deserves and the husband Megan deserves. That's a good start, Dr. Chen replied, but I need to be clear. Wanting to change and actually changing are two different things. It's going to require sustained effort, professional help, and probably some difficult realizations about yourself. Another contraction hit Megan, and this time Jake didn't hesitate to help her through it. As she gripped his hand and focused on her breathing, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Not just the crushing weight of shame, but the lighter, more purposeful weight of commitment. Whatever it takes, he said to Dr. Chen, his eyes never leaving Megan's face. Whatever it takes to make sure I never hurt her again. Dr. Martinez checked her watch and then examined Megan again. 8 centimeters, she announced. This baby is coming soon. We need to make some final decisions about how we're going to handle this. Megan looked around the room at all the people who had gathered to help her through this moment. Professionals who had become invested in her story, people who wanted to see her and her family find healing. I want Jake to stay, she said firmly. But I want everyone else to stay too. I want our daughter born into a room full of people who believe in second chances and getting help when you need it. The next contraction was the strongest yet, and Megan knew they were approaching the moment when everything would change forever, when she would become a mother, when Jake would become a father, when their family would be complete despite being broken. The hospital gown felt like surrender, thin white cotton that left Megan exposed and vulnerable at the moment when she needed to feel strongest. But as another contraction built to its peak, she realized that vulnerability might be exactly what this moment required. 9 centimeters, Dr. Martinez announced after her latest examination. We're almost there. Jake sat beside the bed, still holding Megan's hand through each wave of pain. The room had settled into a focused calm, with Dr. Chen and Lisa Rodriguez positioned nearby, but giving the couple space to navigate this crucial conversation that had been building since Jake's return. Before our daughter gets here, Megan said, her voice strained but determined, I need to say something. Jake's grip on her hand tightened. Megan, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She turned to face him fully, and Jake saw something in her, eyes he hadn't seen in months, clarity. What you did to me last night was unforgivable, not because I can't forgive you, but because it should never have happened in the first place. Jake nodded, tears already starting. I know, but I also know that the man who hit me isn't the same man who held me when I had morning sickness. He isn't the man who cried when we heard our baby's heartbeat for the first time. And he isn't the man who's been helping me breathe through these contractions for the past hour. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, recognizing the importance of this moment in their healing process. So I need to know, Megan continued, which man am I married to? Which man is about to become the father of my child? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt the weight of it, not just for this moment, but for every moment that would follow. He thought about the suicide note still crumpled in his jacket pocket, about the hours he'd spent on Miller's Bridge, contemplating whether the world would be better off without him in it. I don't know, he said finally, his honesty surprising everyone, including himself. I thought I knew who I was, but these past few months have shown me there are parts of myself I never dealt with. Anger I inherited from my childhood that I thought I'd left behind. Fear about being a father that I didn't even know I was carrying. Another contraction interrupted them, and Jake automatically shifted into the breathing pattern they'd learned together. When it passed, Megan was looking at him with something that might have been hope. But I want to find out, Jake continued. I want to do the work to figure out who I really am, not just who I think I should be. I want to understand why I hurt you, so I can make sure it never happens again. What does that look like? Megan asked. Specifically, what are you willing to commit to? Jake looked around the room at the professionals who had gathered to help them. Officer Rey, who could have arrested him but had instead focused on getting him help. Dr. Chen, who was treating his crisis with compassion rather than just judgment. Lisa Rodriguez, who was here to support Megan but hadn't made him feel like a monster. I'll do individual therapy, he said, and anger management. And if you're willing, couples counseling, though I understand if you're not ready for that. What about the legal stuff? Megan's voice was practical, focused. What about taking responsibility for what you did? I'll cooperate completely with whatever Officer Rey recommends. If that means charges, if that means jail time, if that means a restraining order while I get help, whatever keeps you and our daughter safe. Dr. Martinez cleared her throat. I hate to interrupt, but we're at 10 centimeters. This baby is ready to be born. The room immediately shifted into delivery mode. Jake found himself pushed to one side as medical equipment was positioned and the delivery team took their places. For a moment he wondered if he was about to be asked to leave, if this was where his role in their story ended. But Megan reached for his hand. Stay, she said simply. Help me bring our daughter into the world. The next few minutes were a blur of medical instructions and overwhelming sensations. Jake had attended childbirth classes, had read books about labor and delivery, but nothing had prepared him for the raw intensity of watching Megan work to bring their child into the world. I can see the head, Dr. Martinez announced. One more big push, Megan. Jake squeezed his wife's hand, and she squeezed back with a strength that reminded him exactly who he'd fallen in love with. A woman who faced challenges head-on, who didn't back down from difficult conversations, who was currently doing the most difficult physical work of her life while also navigating the emotional wreckage of their marriage. You're incredible, he whispered to her. You're the strongest person I know. Megan looked at him through her exhaustion and pain, and for a moment Jake saw not fear in her eyes, but something else. Determination. She was going to get through this. She was going to become a mother, and somehow, despite everything that had happened, she was going to find a way to build a safe life for their daughter. Push, Dr. Martinez commanded, and Megan bore down with everything she had. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the sound that would change everything. Their daughter's first cry, announcing her arrival into a complicated world that was already working hard to become better for her. The first cry was everything Jake had imagined it would be, fierce, indignant, and absolutely perfect. Their daughter announced her arrival with a sound that seemed to fill not just the delivery room, but every corner of Jake's heart that had been empty and afraid. "She's beautiful," Dr. Martinez said, holding up the tiny, red-faced baby who was protesting loudly about being evicted from her warm, quiet home. "Completely healthy." Jake felt his knees go weak. He'd been present for the birth, had watched his daughter emerge into the world, but the reality of her existence didn't fully hit him until he heard that cry. This was his child. This tiny person with perfect fingers and toes was depending on him to be better than he'd been yesterday. "Can I—" he started to ask, then stopped himself. Did he have the right to hold her? After what he'd done, did he deserve this moment? Megan answered the question he couldn't finish asking. "Let him hold her," she told Dr. Martinez, her voice exhausted but firm. "Let him meet his daughter." The baby was placed in Jake's arms, with careful instruction about supporting her head. She was so small, so incredibly fragile, and Jake felt terror mix with overwhelming love as he looked down at her face. She had Megan's nose, and what looked like it might become his chin. Her eyes were squeezed shut, but when Jake spoke to her, she seemed to quiet slightly. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm your daddy, and I promise you, I swear to you, I'm going to spend every day of my life becoming the man you deserve to have as a father." Tears were streaming down his face, and he made no effort to stop them. In his arms was the most important person in his world, and she was perfect and innocent and completely trusting that the adults around her would keep her safe. Officer Rey watched from her position near the door, and Jake caught her eye over the baby's head. "I understand now," he said to her. "I understand what I could have destroyed." Dr. Chen approached slowly. "Jake, how are you feeling right now?" "Grateful," Jake replied without hesitation. "And terrified. And more aware than I've ever been of how much I have to lose if I don't get my act together." Lisa Rodriguez, the crisis counselor, had been quietly observing the family's first moments together. "That awareness is important," she said gently. "It's the beginning of change, not the end of it." Megan held out her arms, and Jake carefully transferred their daughter to her. Watching Megan hold their baby, seeing the immediate fierce protectiveness that came over her face, made Jake understand in a new way what he'd put at risk. "What are we going to name her?" Megan asked, looking down at their daughter with wonder. They'd discussed names for months, but had never settled on anything definitive. Jake had liked Emma after Megan's grandmother. Megan had preferred Hope, for reasons that seemed more relevant now than ever. "Hope," Jake said quietly. "I think she should be Hope." Megan smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since before their fight. "Hope Emma Patterson," she said, testing the sound of it. "Hi, Hope. Welcome to the world, little one." Dr. Martinez finished her post-delivery procedures while the family bonded, but Jake was aware that this interlude of normalcy was temporary. Officer Rey was still in the room. Dr. Chen was still conducting his evaluation. The real world, with its consequences and requirements, was waiting just outside this bubble of new parent bliss. As if reading his thoughts, Officer Rey approached the bed. "Jake, I need to talk to you about next steps." Jake nodded, reluctantly, taking his eyes off Hope to focus on the conversation that would determine his immediate future. "Based on what you've told me and what Dr. Chen has observed, I'm recommending that you be admitted to the psychiatric wing for evaluation and treatment," Rey said. "It's not jail, but it's not going home either. You'll be here in the hospital, getting the help you need while ensuring your family's safety. For how long? That depends on your progress. Dr. Chen will make that determination." Jake looked at Megan, who was watching Hope's tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. "What do you think?" he asked her. "I think our daughter deserves a father who's committed to being healthy," Megan said without looking up. "If that means you need to be in treatment for a while, then that's what needs to happen. And us? What happens to us while I'm getting help?" This time Megan did look at him, and Jake saw something in her eyes that looked like the beginning of forgiveness. Not forgiveness for what he'd done, but forgiveness for the possibility of who he might become. "We'll figure it out," she said, "one day at a time. But Jake, this is your one chance. If you ever hurt me again, if you ever put hope at risk, there won't be another conversation like this one." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of what she was offering him. "One chance is more than I deserve. I won't waste it." Hope made a small sound in her sleep, and both parents immediately turned their attention back to her. Whatever happened next, this moment was theirs, their first moment. As a family, imperfect but full of love and possibility. 3 months later, the new family photo sat on the kitchen table of their small apartment, surrounded by the familiar chaos of life with a newborn. In the picture, Megan and Jake flanked Hope's hospital bassinet, both looking exhausted but genuinely happy. It was a far cry from the wedding photo that had been face down on their nightstand the morning everything changed. Jake lived in a small studio apartment 6 blocks away now, close enough to help with Hope, far enough to give Megan the space she needed to heal. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but it was working. He came by every morning before his new job at Henderson Construction, spent evenings helping with feeding and diaper changes, and left each night knowing he'd earned another day of being trusted. With his daughter's care, the transition hadn't been smooth. The first week after his release from the psychiatric wing had been especially difficult. Jake had wanted to come home immediately, to return to their normal routine as if nothing had changed. But Megan had stood firm about her boundaries, and Dr. Chen had supported her decision. "Healing isn't just about Jake getting better," Dr. Chen had explained during one of their family therapy sessions. "It's about Megan rebuilding her sense of safety and autonomy. That takes time and space." The individual therapy sessions had been harder than Jake had expected. Dr. Rodriguez, a different Rodriguez than the crisis counselor he'd learned, specialized in trauma and anger management. She'd helped Jake understand the connection between his childhood experiences and his reaction to stress as an adult. "You learned very early that anger was dangerous and destructive," she'd told him during one particularly difficult session. "But you never learned healthy ways to express frustration or fear. So when you became overwhelmed, you defaulted to the patterns you witnessed as a child." The anger management classes met twice a week in the basement of St. Mary's Community Center. Jake had been skeptical at first, sitting in a circle with other men who'd made similar mistakes, talking about feelings and coping strategies. But gradually, he'd begun to see the value in it. "The goal isn't to never feel angry," the group leader, Marcus, had explained. Marcus was a former boxer who'd nearly destroyed his own marriage before getting help 15 years earlier. "The goal is to feel angry without becoming dangerous." Jake had learned to recognize his warning signs. The tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing became shallow, the feeling that he was being backed into a corner. More importantly, he'd learned to excuse himself from situations before. Those feelings escalated into something destructive. Megan had her own healing to do. The individual therapy sessions with Dr. Sarah Kim had helped her understand that what had happened wasn't her fault, but they'd also helped her recognize warning signs she'd been ignoring for months. "I kept making excuses for his mood changes," she told Dr. Kim during one session. "I convinced myself it was just work stress, just the pregnancy, just temporary. I didn't want to see that something deeper was wrong." The couple's counseling sessions were the hardest for both of them. Sitting in Dr. Chen's office every Wednesday evening, they had to confront not just the night Jake had hit her, but all the ways their relationship had become unhealthy in the months leading up to that moment. "Communication is about more than just talking," Dr. Chen had observed after watching them navigate a particularly difficult conversation about finances. "It's about listening, about being curious about your partner's perspective, about making space for each other's feelings without becoming defensive." They were both learning to do that, slowly, imperfectly, but consistently. Mrs. Chen had become an unofficial grandmother to Hope, bringing homemade soup when Megan was struggling with breastfeeding, offering to babysit when the young parents Needed time for therapy appointments or just a few hours to remember who they were outside of their roles as mother and father. Healing is like tending garden, she'd told Jake one evening when he'd stopped by to pick up Hope. Must water every day, even when don't see growth happening, especially then. Officer Rey checked in periodically, not in an official capacity anymore, but as someone who had become invested in their story. She'd helped Jake navigate the legal consequences of his actions, community service, probation, and a permanent record that would follow him, but hadn't destroyed his ability to find work or rebuild his life. "You're one of the success stories," she told him during their last official meeting. "Most domestic situations I respond to don't end with the family intact and everyone getting help." The success felt fragile to Jake, earned day by day through small choices and consistent effort. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when he felt the old anger rising, moments when Megan seemed distant despite their progress, moments when he wondered if they were trying to rebuild something that had been too badly damaged. But then Hope would smile at him, really smile, not just gas or reflexes, but genuine recognition and joy at seeing her father's face. And Jake would remember why every difficult conversation, every therapy session, every night spent alone in his small apartment was worth it. The evening light was fading as Jake prepared to leave their apartment after another day of shared parenting. Hope was asleep in her crib, finally settled after a fussy afternoon. Megan walked him to the door, a routine that had developed over the past month. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, the question that ended each of his visits. "Same time tomorrow," Jake confirmed. Then, because he'd learned to be honest about his feelings instead of hiding them, he added, "I love you, both of you. I know I'm not supposed to expect anything, but I want you to know that." Megan looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said finally. "And Jake, I'm starting to love you again too. Not the same way as before, but maybe in a better way. A way that's built on who we actually are instead of who we thought we were." It wasn't a declaration of reunion, but it was hope. As Jake walked back to his apartment, he could see their kitchen window glowing warm and yellow in the gathering dusk. Someday, if he continued to do the work, if he continued to prove himself worthy of trust, he might be coming home to that light instead of walking away from it. But for now, this was enough, this daily opportunity to be a father to Hope and a partner to Megan in building something better than what they'd lost.